Oh, there's so many yummy vegetarian options out there. You could try like lentil soup, veggie burgers, tofu stir fry. The possibilities are endless. Welcome! In this explainer, we're going to dive into the absolutely crucial world of intercompany transfer pricing. We'll be breaking down exactly how multinational corporations handle the pricing of transactions between their own divisions in different countries. Now, this is a core concept in international tax, and believe me, it has massive financial implications.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start with the global supply chain to really get the business context down. Then we'll dig into the big challenge, the incentive for companies to shift profits. From there, we'll look at the solution, the arm's length standard, and the three key methods for putting it into practice. We'll wrap things up by looking at the ultimate goal of all these rules, which is to avoid the nightmare of double taxation. All right, let's get started.
Okay, first things first. We need to understand the reality for any multinational corporation today. The fact is, if you're a global business, you're creating value in many different places, all across the world. So let's think about a few common scenarios. Imagine a Canadian parent company. Maybe it sells its finished products to a subsidiary in France for distribution, or maybe it ships component parts to a factory in Mexico for final assembly, or it could even be selling raw materials to a plant in Germany for processing. In every single one of these cases, what you have is an internal, cross-border sale, and the price tag on that sale, that's what we call the transfer price. Now, this is where things get really interesting and complicated because you have these internal transactions happening all the time, and you also have different corporate tax rates in every country. You put those two things together, and suddenly you've got a major headache for tax authorities everywhere. And this slide, this question, is the absolute heart of the matter. This is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Because the answer determines which country gets to tax the profits a company makes. If you think about it, any rational company wants to minimize its tax bill. So there's a really powerful incentive to arrange your internal prices to make sure most of the profit shows up in the country with the lowest tax rate. For instance, if your company is in a high-tax country, you might be tempted to sell your goods to your own subsidiary in a low-tax country for a super low price. That way, you report less profit at home and more profit where the taxes are lower. And you've got to realize, it's not just about the price of goods. Oh no. Profits can be shifted in all sorts of ways, through management service charges, sales commissions, interest on intercompany loans, rent for property, or royalties for intellectual property. All of it, every single one of these, falls under the transfer pricing umbrella. So to fight this incentive to shift profits, tax authorities all around the world, Canada included, have agreed on a single guiding principle. The whole point is to make sure profits get taxed where the real business activity happens. And to do that, you need a consistent test that applies to everyone. And that standard is the arm's length principle. It's a really simple idea, but it's incredibly powerful. It just says you have to price a transaction between your own companies as if they were total strangers, each negotiating independently in a normal, open market. Now, this wording here, drawn from Canadian tax law, is so important. Look at that phrase, reasonably have been expected. This is the legal foundation. It acknowledges that, there might not be one single perfect price, but there is a reasonable range of prices, and it has to be based on real market evidence. Okay, so that's the principle, but how do you actually apply it in the real world? Defining what's reasonable can get pretty complex. So let's look at the three main methods that are endorsed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. To help figure out that arm's length price, three main traditional methods have been established. Now, the method you choose really depends on the kind of transaction you're looking at and, crucially, what kind of reliable data you can get your hands on. The first one, the comparable uncontrolled price method, we just call it CUP, is really the gold standard. It's the most direct and preferred method. If your company sells the exact same thing to its own subsidiary and to a totally independent customer, well, there's your benchmark. The price you charge that outside party is considered the most reliable evidence of an arm's length price. But what happens when you don't have a perfect comparison like that? Say you only sell internally. Well, then you might use the cost-plus method. With this one, you basically build the price from the ground up. You start with the actual cost to produce the item or service, and then you add a reasonable markup for profit. The trick, of course, is figuring out what a reasonable markup is, and that's usually based on what similar independent companies are earning. And then there's the third approach, the resale price method, which kind of works backwards from the other end. This is really common for distribution companies. You start with the price your subsidiary charges its final outside customer. Then you subtract a fair profit margin for that subsidiary, enough to cover its own costs and make a reasonable profit. What's left over? Well, that's your arm's length transfer price.
So we've gone through the why and the how. Finally, let's talk about the ultimate goal of all these complex rules. This isn't just about following the law for the sake of it. There is a huge commercial reason to get this right. And this really gets to the core philosophy of it all. The entire transfer pricing framework is designed to force a company's internal pricing to be based on real-world business logic, not just on clever tax planning. The price has to reflect the actual work being done, the assets being used, and the risks being taken by each part of the company. Because if you get this wrong, the biggest risk you face is double taxation. Let's say the Canadian Tax Authority decides you underpriced your exports to your German subsidiary. They'll adjust your profit up in Canada and send you a bigger tax bill. The problem is, Germany has no obligation to agree with that, and they might tax the German subsidiary on its original, higher profit anyway. And just like that, the exact same income gets taxed twice. It's a financial nightmare.
So, at the end of the day, the choice is pretty stark. You can have a stable, defensible policy that's grounded in business reality, or you can pursue an aggressive, tax-driven policy that's just begging for audits, penalties, and that incredibly painful burden of double taxation. The consequences of getting it wrong are just not worth the risk. Which leaves us with one final and, I think, critical question for any international business out there to think about. A strong transfer pricing policy isn't about tax convenience. It's a fundamental pillar of a sound global business strategy and a cornerstone of effective risk management.